Hey Deepa, how's it going?
Hi, Puja. Good. How are you?
Just a second. For some reason, I'm not able to hear your audio.
Oh, no. I thought we fixed that.
Sorry about that. Hi everyone. Welcome to our live stream. I'm here with Deepa. I think we have a little bit of technical difficulties.
Hi, Puja. Can you hear me now?
You're able to hear me okay, right, Deepa? Yeah?
Yes. Can you hear me, though? Or can you not?
Hello.
Oh.
Let us know where you're all joining in from while we get this sorted. Did you want to jump
I'm
back
doing
on?
audio testing on uh, on the app, and it seems to work.
Hi. Are you all able to hear us? Just wanted to get a little bit of an overview. Oh, we can hear you
Okay.
both. Why isn't it that I can't hear you? Deepa, you're
Thank you,
audible.
Sangarupa
Okay,
and
great.
Pradyumna. Seems like you can
Let
hear me.
me see if this is an issue with me. Sorry. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Oh, no.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Do you want to maybe check the settings? Maybe sometimes it just toggles between different devices by mistake. Just buggy.
Oh no, technical difficulties.
Sorry about the audio problem, everyone. We will get this sorted in just a minute. We have some
Sorry
really
about that,
exciting
folks.
topics on public workspaces today that I'm super excited to talk about.
Just a second as I get this sorted.
Where is everyone joining us from?
For some reason, I'm not able to hear.
Are you not able to hear anything at all? Oh, no. We have Naveen from India. We have Valeria from Belarus.
Sorry about
Thanks
that,
for
Deepa.
joining. We have Damien from North
Hello
California.
from
We
Utah,
have,
from India. Thank you all for joining at this time.
thank you.
Um,
So exciting. We have a lot of global
we
presence
were
in this
just
chat
chatting on
today.
this actually.
It's interesting. We actually joined earlier and we were having a chat. We were all set up and prepped. And as soon as we went live, the audio seemed to turn off for Puja. It's so interesting how technical
I'm so
difficulties end up
sorry
happening
about this.
right when you want to go live. Part of the process, though. So we worked through it. We have Somaya from Egypt. We have Gokul from India. Shelly from India. Harshit. Thank you for joining us. We're just working through some technical difficulties. Puja is not able to get any audio, so we will just figure that out in a minute and get started. Okay.
I don't think there's a possible way for me to connect with my phone, but I am trying to see if I can restart this stream and rejoin. So I'll be right back and see if that works for me. Yeah.
Yeah, let's try that. Hello, Saurabh. We have Victoria from Ukraine. Yes, I understand. It's probably not the stream. It's the app that we use for streaming that could be glitching, actually.
I can
Pooja,
hear
can you
you
hear us?
slightly. Let me see if I can just join with another browser. I apologize for that.
Yes, browser makes a big difference. It's really interesting how uh, sometimes switching the browser can help. I was having that difficulty earlier today. Uh, so, hi everyone. While Pooja joins, I can go ahead and tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Deepa. I'm a product strategy lead at Postman, and I have a background in data science. I switched into product management a couple of years ago, and for the past 5 years, I've been an API product manager. And most recently, before Postman, I was at Twilio, and then I was at PayPal, and I actually helped launch PayPal's public collection. And I was the PM for that initiative, and I helped them launch their public collection, where we were able to really grow our developer base, being able to expose our collection on the Postman public network, get developers to their first API call really quickly. We got a great response. We will be walking through the PayPal collection later in this stream, but first we will start with learning about what the public network is, and then we will dive into how you can use it and how it can be really valuable for you.
Awesome. Can you hear me okay now, Deepa?
Yes, I
Yes.
can hear you.
Okay, great. All right. I'm so sorry, everyone. I had some technical difficulties with my browser, but I can hear everyone great now. So I'm so glad that y'all are here. My name is Puja, and I am a developer advocate here. And yes, I did try turning it on and off again, professional trip. So thank you so much. So I'm happy that you're all able to hear me and we're able to kind of get back to where we started. So yeah, I feel like there's a lot that has happened in Postman world before you know in the past couple of months. And I think, I don't know, Deepa, if you had a chance to chat about it, but one big thing that recently happened is that we are now announcing Postman V10. So Postman V10 is the brand new version of Postman, and it has some really exciting features. Some of these features.
Just a second. There is some noise from your mic. Am I the only one hearing that? Yeah, there is a slight static feedback on your mic.
Okay, let me just see. Let me just change my mic.
Yeah, I was wondering if I was the only one hearing that. So I think other people can too.
Yeah, can you hear that? Can you
Yes,
hear me?
it's much better now.
All right, great.
Yes.
So yeah,
you can dive into the exciting new features. We just rolled out Postman V10. It's the latest version.
yeah.
And we have an exciting blog post out there outlining all the new features.
Yep, definitely. And so some of these features include, redesign of the native Git support. So we have a brand new redesign of our API builder. So this is great for anyone who is a producer of APIs. And we also have a brand new gRPC support as well. So Postman V10 has a lot more support for gRPC protocols. And then we also have a brand new Postman CLI, and this is a wonderful feature for those of you who might be testing and working with automation. And then also we have a brand new partner workspace. So this is a new feature, and this is new to Postman partners, and it's a great place for partner collaboration as well. So and so we've discussed a lot of these features in this new space camp called Unboxing What is New in Postman. So for those of you who might have not, are a little bit more interested in like some of these brand new V10 features, definitely take a look at what is new in Postman V10. We have a live stream that actually happened yesterday, so you can definitely check this out on Postman Space Camp. I'm going to add the link of where you can find that. On our Postman. So you can take a look at like the space camps and take a look at some of the resources there to get started. But, I think a good segue from partner workspaces today, I think, Deepa, I think today's all about, I guess, public workspaces, right?
Yeah, there's quite a few things that I'm excited about in V10 that you outlined. Git support, I think, is one that I'm very excited about. The CLI,
Yeah.
and of course, partner workspaces. Especially like I was sharing with the audience when you were having difficulties with your audio that I have worked in launch. I worked at launching public collections at PayPal, and it's a very interesting process. So I'm also very familiar with the partner workspaces and the use cases there. So it's a very exciting feature, and I think something that people don't really always recognize is how much work that goes on that is not entirely internal, not entirely public facing, but somewhere in the middle where it's specific partners. So I'm super excited about how partner workspaces can enable a pretty large segment of API business, actually.
Definitely, yeah. And so today, I think, that, we definitely have like partner workspaces and, private workspace. But I think today we really want to kind of hone in on the public side of things. And so I think a lot of, maybe Postman users might not know or are maybe coming to become more aware, but we have a entire network of public APIs with that are discoverable by users. And so this is something that I think is a really great aspect of Postman. I think that I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into. And so I think, let me just make sure that I'm pretty audible, correct?
Yeah, I can hear you
Okay. All
perfectly
right.
fine.
Cool. I hope that I just heard. So today I wanted to talk a little bit more about exploring the world of APIs. And so to do this, we have our Explore network. And so, Deepa, you want to chat a little bit about exactly, what that is? And
Absolutely.
Yeah? All right.
So,
Awesome.
so it's really interesting. There's a few different ways I think about the public network. There's uh, on Postman, you have this possibility of just publicly publishing your work, which I think is very parallel to how developers publish their work on Git in a lot of ways. And from a business perspective, it's also very interesting because uh, you can have your public-facing APIs showcased in a public-facing collection using this. And the interesting thing is because there's so many developers who already are familiar with Postman, and there is not such a steep learning curve, then anybody who's like trying to use your APIs for the first time can use your public collection and get started really quickly. So that's in the early phase of discovery and evaluation when you're like looking for a certain API, being able to find the API, evaluate which one you want to go with, which one you want to integrate with, be able to test it out, try it out before building a lot, before
Yeah.
having to like, through too much documentation. I think the public network and this experience really simplifies that journey for customers. So this is the Explore page, is kind of the landing page, and I think there's a few exciting things here, like our how you can filter through all the collections, like you can go by domain, like financial services or DevOps. I think we also have trending workspaces, which I always look at, which is very fun.
Totally. So I figure let's like go through some of these like workspaces and kind of like talk a little bit about certain categories and what makes like a good public work profile. I think that would be something that I think is really interesting. So I wanted to start here on the left-hand side and kind of talk a little bit about categories. So categories, I think, within the Postman Explore network, these are places where companies that have specific APIs, we've categorized them in specific buckets, such as like artificial intelligence, developer productivity, payments. And as we grow our repository, we're looking forward to adding more and more APIs. So specifically here, if we were to dive into like the communications world, right? We have some really great collections and workspaces for that developers can get started with right away, right? So I think one of this really interesting aspect of this, like if we were to just look at, for example, the Lob APIs, we can see their public workspace, and we can see some of their collections, which is interesting. But we can see like the amount of forks and the amount of watches that this particular workspace gets. So
there's a lot of information on this page.
Yeah.
So let me just break it down for people. So there is, of course, the collection on the left, but if you see, there's also the activity, and the change log that gets generated. And I personally found it really useful because when I'm looking for a specific type of API, and let's say a mapping or a payment or anything, I would look at their collections to see how frequently or how recently they've been updated, because from a development standpoint, it's like I don't want to use an API that's possibly dormant. And if I'm looking at a collection, I'm curious if they are actively updating their collection, because that would really mean that it's more accurate in terms of how the APIs currently work. And if you go back to the last page, Puja, where you had that open, those are like kind of from a user standpoint, that becomes very important, like in terms of like, do I want to use these APIs or not?
Right. Yeah, totally. And I think like one big aspect of creating a public workspace is having one place where your documentation exists as well as your API. And I think that that reduces like the time to first call. That's a big aspect of API, public API development, correct?
Absolutely. So from a producer standpoint, is like if you're making and publishing APIs, then you want your customers to be able to learn about your APIs, be able to build with them, get to that first API call as easily as possible. So you want to reduce that friction. It shouldn't take me like a training session or an hour of reading documents to just get started. Started should be super quick. And from a customer standpoint, I also don't, if I'm a customer, I'm a consumer of certain APIs, then I don't want to spend too much time, because if an API is too complicated to learn or get started with, it's probably going to be very complicated to maintain in the future. So it really shows what my experience is going to be in the long run. So I think on both sides, from a producer and a consumer side of an API, being able to get started quickly is a lot of value.
Totally. I'm going to go back to the explore page because I feel like there's a lot more we can explore here. So
Yeah.
we have some categories as well, and we also have some curated lists, and these are lists that are curated from the Postman team itself. So like if we take a look at some of the curated ones, like let's dive into like APIs for beginners. So these are really great for people that are like, I think this workspace, for example, public REST APIs, these are all of the APIs that are, available, that are created by the Postman org. And these are really interesting APIs, such as like, third-party APIs, COVID-19 APIs. I think some of these collections in here can be really useful when it comes to, developing things and using public data. So that's something actually really interesting. Do you have any other thoughts on this page that you've played around with, Deepa?
So I was curious from the audience today how familiar people are with the idea of like public and partner workspaces.
Yeah, I'm curious too.
With
I
any
mean,
responses.
I feel like if I'm curious how many people have worked with or have started exploring APIs on this particular workspace. And if you have, let us know. I think someone has talked about the PayPal workspace that they've worked with. So that's definitely something that, we'll dive a little bit deeper into what that looks like. But the way that I think, to, I guess, like break it down, Deepa, like the differences between the public workspaces and private and partner. Did you want to dive a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah, I think we got one response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the public.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So the public workspace. Yeah. Go ahead.
So if you just click on the API network on the top left,
Yep.
I want to show people that we have the private network that's within your team when you're developing or building, let's say, internal APIs that only within your organization are being used. Those are private. That's not something you're enabling external users outside your organization to use. Then you have public network, which is anything that's public. Now, the interesting thing is majority of the APIs in the world are actually internal or partner. A smaller percentage is actually public, and that's of course because in any organization, a major chunk of infrastructure, a lot of the internal APIs are, there's just more of them to actually enable your business versus the few that you expose as service to your external users. So from a sheer volume perspective, there's just more internal APIs and partner APIs than there are public. But when we work in the public domain or as a consumer, we're looking for certain APIs, we're looking just at the company's public API offering. So when we look at, for example, PayPal has like thousands of internal APIs, but then they have a limited set that is public, and that's what we end up using as customers. So that's like a curated, specially designed set of APIs. Same with any other offering like Google Maps or Stripe or any of these. And now there is starting to be a need for partner workspaces, which is where there's a couple of different use cases. One being that if you're working in an organization and that is building some APIs specifically for a customer, you could potentially be developing in collaboration. Maybe developers from both companies are going to come together and work on these APIs, or it could be just a matter of like being able to get feedback from your customer. But then this is because this is for a special use case. it is not something you want to publicly enable for everybody, but keep it limited to that particular customer set of customers. So that's where the partner workspaces comes in, which is a new feature we just launched with V10. Uh, and although public network, we've had it for a while, and that's where we have the commercial APIs such as PayPal and Twilio and Stripe and everything. But we also have a lot of free APIs that are more for educational purposes, that are published by a lot of variety of people. So I think that the fascinating thing is, because anybody can publish to the Postman public network, it really gives an opportunity to developers out there who are building collections for enabling other developers to get used to and learn about certain APIs. So I think that level field of, like, it's not just for enterprise, it's really any developer out there, is something I find really, really exciting.
Yeah. So someone made a comment, like had a question. So public workspaces meaning public APIs, and then I think someone also mentioned that it's similar to like a Git public repo. And so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit, like, let's just give you an insight of what kind of that looks like. So I'm actually part of a specific team. So I'm part of, my DevRel team. So if I were to take a look at my public workspace in my public API network, I can see all of the popular collections and the workspaces that my team has created. So, for example, within my team, if I were to go ahead and create a workspace, if I created a public workspace here, and I gave it a name and a summary, that public workspace would actually show up as a part of my public API network. So this is actually really interesting. So when you work, you have a Postman profile, when you work on a Postman team and you want to publicize your APIs for them to be reached by others and to be found and searched by others, very similar, I guess, to a GitHub repo, right, Deepa? I think what you would need to do is
That's
like
right.
build a public profile for your APIs to be discoverable. So at this point, if you go to postman.com/devrel, you're able to see some of these popular collections, as well as some popular APIs. So one collection that I've worked on is this 10 Postman feature collection. And you can see that it's already had 200 plus forks, 200 plus watches, and over 10,000 views. So this is actually really great metrics when it comes to, increasing your adoption when it comes to building out your APIs. So this is, I guess, at Postman, we encourage people that have public APIs to publish them on a public network. And so I think,
So quick note there.
yeah.
I do want to address couple of questions, couple of messages there. So one is, yes, it is like Git public repo,
Mhm.
and the other thing is, public workspace doesn't necessarily mean public API. So you can potentially have internal APIs, but create a public workspace around it. The workspace is really the work you do, which is you build a collection. But if you end up using APIs in that collection that are not publicly available, then anybody who forks it may not be able to use them. So the visibility of the API is not, like, technically tied to the definition of public or private. It is, however, a best practice to use public APIs in your public workspaces, because you want to expose and enable other customers or other developers to be able to fork them and use them and get value out of them. So that's really a best practice. But if you feel that it's for any use case, if you do decide to publish internal API related collections or workspaces to your public workspace, it's not going to error out or anything.
Right. Did you want to kind of go into some of the value propositions when it comes to creating public workspaces? So I wanted to share this very interesting blog by my colleague Joyce, and it's called Increasing Adoption with API Public Workspaces. So, I think this is a really great blog because it kind of goes into some of the things that you need to think about when you first set up your public workspace in Postman. And, I think when you first set up your public workspace, there's definitely a couple of checklists. But before we go into that, let's dive into why we want to even create public workspaces. Yeah?
Absolutely. So it's when we think about public workspaces in general, we're thinking about getting our APIs out there for our customers or other developers to discover and to start using. So that's really the goal of why you would publish on the public network, is to enable developers to be able to use it. And when we think about, as if I'm somebody who's producing an API, I'm an API producer, then I want my customers to be able to look at my APIs, be able to make their first API calls as easily and in a frictionless way as possible. So that's really the number one value prop of why you would want to publish your APIs and your public collections, is to enable your developer to get to that time, to reduce that time to first API call. And it's a key metric that we follow in a lot of different organizations. Have seen who build APIs for consumers, and it's really, we measure the time it takes for a developer to discover your API to the time they actually make their first API call. Sometimes some organizations would actually measure time from account creation to the first API call. So there's a little bit of variation depending on the different organizations, but it's a pretty important metric of how developers are, how easy or difficult your APIs are in terms of getting started.
Right.
And that would determine how, if the developers are able to realize their use cases, because if you're not able to get started, then you can't really build on it.
Right.
So that's where it starts to kind of go next. Can you go back to the list? I wanted to talk to that list that we were showing people. Yeah. So the other interesting thing about public workspaces is collaboration. So a lot like Git, people can actually fork. People can comment and create pull requests. So there is an aspect of collaboration that public workspaces enable, which I think is very useful. And I think from the perspective of big organizations, we do see developers who are very engaged and they have spent some time, and sometimes they would be able to point out bugs, or they would be able to point out gaps in our documentation through their public workspace comments. I think those were always really fascinating for me to read. I think this idea of companies just produce a product and people just use them, evolving into a way that people can actually contribute and give feedback and make it like a nice feedback loop and more of a collaborative process rather than a one-way street, is a great value add, is especially something like APIs, because a lot of times when we are building APIs, we tend to sort of have some ideas in mind and our own biases, and sometimes it could also be things like terminology, internal terminology seeps in that is not something that makes sense to the developers trying to use these APIs. So I think having those comments and feedback and things become really useful. And from the consumer side, if I'm somebody looking at a public collection, then having this information around how quickly it's updated. If it's an official collection, like it's, the PayPal collection is published by PayPal,
Yeah.
you have a certain amount of trust that, hey, it would be updated, it would be accurate, and it would work. So I think there's the value in terms of being able to trust the information that we're getting.
Totally, yeah. And I think like when we talk about like trust and those things, I feel like a lot of that trust comes from like documentation and the way that a public workspace is created and documented. And with that said, I feel like there's a really great checklist when it comes to building your first workspace. So like if you work in a team profile and you're building out a workspace, I think it's so important. Like I think the documentation piece plays such an important role in getting your API visible and used correctly. So any thoughts on that, Deepa, as we kind of talk a lot about documentation and adding specifications and collections to your
Yeah,
workspace?
absolutely. So something I've done before is actually connecting the documentation that we see on the site, like the API reference,
Mhm.
directly feeds into the public workspace.
Yeah,
What that does is the documentation is always updated, always accurate, and as close to the source of truth as possible. So what that does is when you drive the documentation in your collection directly from the source, then you're able to that's one of the best practices. But of course, people
right.
can, if you have the bandwidth, you can always create custom documentation depending on different organizations. But we recommend uh, using the same that you use for API references so that you have that consistency. And ultimately, if your documentation is accurate and thorough, then essentially as a user, if I'm using your Postman public collection, I don't have to go to also your site, also open up API references like
Mhm.
separately. So you can work in a single workspace where you have your documentation and you can get started. So I think having quality documentation, having it
Right.
integrated in your Postman collection really helps customers not have to jump between tabs or different windows and just be able to work in a single spot.
Do we want to go ahead and like see this in action by like looking at like a specific workspace? Like I think maybe diving deeper into like maybe the PayPal workspaces. Do you think that would be
Yeah, let's
good,
do it.
Deepa? All right, great. So, we showed you like the different categories on this Explore network. We showed you like curated lists and as well as any recommended collections and trending collections. I think to find, of course, the way to search for public APIs, you can use the search bar up at top. So I can search for PayPal here. And I can see their team profile. So when I have a team profile, I think it gives me a little bit more trust in that documentation uh, uh, and the APIs that are available there. But I can also see the different, um, uh, you know, workspaces that have been created by other people within all of Postman network. So you can see that there are other users that might have created other projects. So another interesting thing is to, take a look at some of these other collections and see, okay, is somebody already solving the problem that I am looking to solve? Or do I want to look at their APIs from scratch and try to build my own workspace out of that? So in this case, I'm going to take a look at specifically like the PayPal, their public page. And I think this is a great place to get started, especially when I'm like looking at it from scratch. So Do you recommend, Deepa, any collection in here we should take a look at? I guess there's the PayPal
Yeah, we just have
API,
one
one major.
collection.
Yeah. All right. So let's see. So if I go take a look at this collection, and I can take a look at their documentation.
Actually, before you click through it, let's just go slow so I can talk
Yeah,
people
sure.
through. Let's go one step back if we can.
All right. So we're here at the workspace.
Yes. So
Yep.
while we're here, I do want to address one question we got from Aksar Ahmed Khan on the chat. He's asking the API documentation versus API references. And if you have good optimized API reference that has tutorials and guides and helping material, then you don't necessarily need separate documentation. You can go with your reference. I hope that answers your question. And yes, I hope I'm saying your name right, Ian. He said that Google actually indexes Postman collections. So when you search on Google, you can easily find Postman collections. The other thing I want to highlight is like when generally you are looking for APIs and you do a Google search, what happens is you get a mix of results. You get sometimes, depending on how much the company making the APIs have SEO optimized their site, they show up. Sometimes blogs show up showing like, oh, here's like 5 different payment APIs you should use, or could be different things, but it's not necessarily. It could also be payment apps. I think there's a mix of things that Google shows you when you're specifically searching for payments or email or things like that. But the advantage here is like when you search something on Postman itself, it's definitely a collection that has APIs.
Yep.
It's a little bit more narrowed down. It's very API specific. So on this page, when you land at a collection from PayPal in this case, you have you can see one of the first things I noticed is that it was recently there was activity as recently as this month, earlier this month, which is great because I know that it's a live collection. I can you can see my name there, Deepa Goyal, on the right, the contributors. You can see if you open the on the left, you can see the list of APIs under that collection on the left.
Yep.
So this is actually a reference collection. So this is all of their public APIs that is available to everybody to use. That's one of the best practices that we recommend at Postman is if you're going to publish a public collection, try not to put anything that's restricted to internal or specific customers so that people who are using this collection are being presented with something they can actually use. So it should ideally be public APIs, but again, you can sometimes by mistake put some APIs that aren't necessarily public.
Right.
And you will see your customers potentially having troubles with it or getting started.
Right.
So generally to avoid that path, you should use public APIs in your public collection. But again, depends on your use case.
And then I think like the most like, as a consumer of maybe this API, I think the first place that I would want to go see is like, okay, like how do I go ahead and use their APIs? And I actually really like that you can write your documentation as a public creator of this API. You can write your documentation directly within the workspace itself. So I like to think of this like as a README file, in a GitHub repository. When you want to use that repo and there's a README, that's where all the documentation exists. That's where you can, talk about getting started and, what to do with that collection. So here,
yeah, this is essentially a getting started guide.
Yeah.
So when you land at the collection, you start with a get started guide. and you can see that there's like 14,000 forks on it. There's some stats that you can see there as a producer, but as a consumer, all you need is like, how do I get started quickly? So you see that information is like step one, step two, going on from there. And you can also jump through sections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so like jump through the exact sections
Yes.
for each of the folders within that specific collection.
So in this case, for example, this documentation is the exact same as the API reference on PayPal's developer site.
Yep.
So it's driven from the same source, and that way, as a developer, you don't have to switch between it. In your Postman collection, you have the API reference available to you.
Awesome. So can we like walk through like that? So that would be available in what, the APIs and SDKs, is that correct? Or the docs?
Yes, APIs and SDKs.
Okay. And then REST APIs. All right. Okay, great. So I'm seeing exactly the docs right here, the authentication. Like let's step through, I guess. Yeah.
Yes.
So for example, like if I were to look at the authorization collection, right? So if I were to compare that to the docs, would that be part of the authentication?
So there is I think the authentication page is like a separate page that is more like a guide.
Yep.
But I think a better example is orders.
Okay. So like orders.
And
okay, great. So these are all the various orders APIs, like create orders, update orders. So it looks like, you know, the sample curl requests are here on the side, but here, if I wanted to work with the specific API, I can actually look at this collection right here and take a look at like that endpoint that's already created for me.
And then on the right, you have the documentation tab right here.
Yes.
So this is where you can see the documentation that is same as the API reference.
Right. Right. And that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's really useful, I think, for users and consumers of this API, to work with this API, knowing how accurate it is to the docs. And I think this is useful for anybody that has public APIs to kind of like, what are some best practices, Deepa, that you can talk about? Like maybe when it comes to building that one-to-one relation.
So building the one-to-one relation between the API reference and so in this case, we, at PayPal, they have a source of truth for what generates the API reference. And as best practice, we are using the same source of truth for generating our API reference web pages as we're using for the Postman collection. So they are always in sync. There is, from an API reference standpoint, for example, we ultimately want people to be able to easily copy paste code. We want them to have information like what do you need in the headers, and what are the different parameters, and all that information. So we replicate all of that. So there shouldn't be any missing information, essentially. So you should start with, if you can. In this case, we didn't have that definition, but like one of the important things would also be to highlight, is this a public API? Is this an API that is in beta, for example? Because as a user, I want to know if the API is beta, or if it is general availability, if it's like an experimental API, so that I can make my usage decision. The other thing is then going into the information about the API endpoint itself, and going into what kind of authorization we need. In this case, you can get started fairly quickly. You can sign up on the PayPal developer portal
Yeah.
and create an account. And I think we are going to walk you through how to do that and where to paste it. Those are some of the best practices that we
Yeah.
have found for creating public collections. But trying to give as much organized information here in the documentation as possible so that developers don't have to like go anywhere else is ideal. Uh, there is also the aspect of use cases. So in this particular case, there's a lot of different things you can do in terms of orders at PayPal.
Yeah.
You can, for example, accept credit card. You can accept various. You can accept a debit card, or you can accept a PayPal payment, PayPal wallet payment.
Right.
So you also have to think about which use case you want to set up your customer with in terms of getting started.
Right.
So in this case, I think we're using PayPal wallet, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
which is fine. I mean, for the purpose of this demo. But something to think about is like, from a customer standpoint, what use case do you want me to try first? And being thoughtful about that, putting out the collection is generally very helpful.
Yeah. And I think like one of the most interesting things when I look in, like when I were to look at like the PayPal documentation, I had seen uh, within the PayPal documentation that there is a place, like if I take a look at like the REST APIs, there is a run and Postman button here. So it looks like within the docs, the Postman public the public collection is linked. So that also
Yes.
increases the adoption of the API as well. So creating that one-to-one link of here the documentation and here is the collection that you can go ahead and work with. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so if somebody is like,
Mhm.
lands at the site, then being able to like jump to the collection, it's like, hey, I have this long web page to read, but if
Right.
I already know Postman as a developer, can I just like jump into Postman and try it out?
Yep.
Uh, so I think that really reduces like the cognitive load of
Yeah.
like going through the documentation before getting started.
Right.
Uh, and it's really, I mean, there's no harm in a developer just making a few API calls. So there's no
Exactly.
reason why we should gate it.
Yeah, and I think like the whole key here, especially for companies that are, building these APIs, is like, how do I get my develop or how do I get anyone to make that first API call? How do I make that time to first API call? I know that, it's sometimes so hard to get stuck in the docs. So when I have the collection directly and it's a public collection, I can go ahead and, I can take a look at the documentation and then I can just create a fork in my own particular workspace. Like let's have this be my team workspace that I'm going to work with, PayPal's APIs. Let me just create this fork and just show you what that looks like. When I create that fork, and once I have that fork, this is like my playground essentially to play with these APIs. And here, I think one of the most interesting things that I think the way that this particular collection was set up is I really liked how all of the variables are set up at a variable level. So, for example, the base URL, the client keys, secret keys, any of the specific details to the public API
So
is
I do
all.
want to highlight in this
Yeah,
case, when you fork the PayPal public collection, there is, as you can see, a pre-filled
yeah,
uh, client key and client ID and client secret. So this is like a open to anyone uh, credentials. So at first, if you didn't even want to create an account and just test out a few APIs, you can do that. So it comes with like a functional ID and secret. And this is one of the best practices. Like, if possible, let's also reduce the friction of having to create an account.
right.
So initially, like if it's not your account, you wouldn't be able to like see all the API logs or things like that, but it doesn't stop you from just like seeing what kind of response you'll get if you were to make an order API. So it'll work.
Oh, cool. So let's
But
take, so if you're
yeah,
saying that if I were to click on create an order, I should be able to see my
yeah,
output
just
directly? Oh, awesome.
yes.
Okay, great. So I can see like that output directly, and that's actually really neat that, that you've built the collection documented. Y'all work to document it that way. That makes it a lot easier to reduce that time. So when I take a look at what my data is, you know, I can use that accordingly. So
Yes,
yeah.
it's really reducing that step, that even one step of like you don't even have to go sign up at PayPal. If you just wanted to see does it work,
Yep.
uh, you can see it.
Yeah.
And then if you wanted to connect it to your own developer account, then you can
Mhm.
update client ID and secret,
Yeah.
and then that would show up in your PayPal developer account.
That's pretty great. That's actually a really great, I think, way that, the team has documented this public API. Makes it a lot easier for the consumer to find what they need and consume it pretty accordingly. I also really like that there are specific tests that, have been run. So I like that, I can see the test directly, like what it should give me. I can see, it extracting the right data as well. So do you recommend when creating a public workspace to include tests into it?
Absolutely. I think, and that's kind of the benefit of having like official collections. Like this is actually published by a team at PayPal,
Yeah.
so there's a certain amount of quality
Right.
standard that they would follow and thought that has been put in
Right.
to how the collection is designed.
Right.
I think testing is a very important aspect of building with APIs, and I think
Yeah.
having those out there is valuable.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. I think a lot of times when, we see, especially on our Explore network, some of the popular APIs and things like that, like it's interesting to see how many collections include tests along with the API itself. And I like that with PayPal, for example, you created that output. So it's really interesting to see that. So yeah, um, I I think I'd love to dive into like more better practices. I think when it comes to getting our uh, users of Postman that are consumers and producers, like how do they, like, just diving back into increasing the adoption. Let's kind of talk a little bit about what success looks like, and what exactly is a successful workspace. So there's a couple of, I don't know, Deepa.
So in
Yeah, any
in
thoughts?
terms of success, there were like four bullet points there. I can expand on them a little bit
Yeah.
though. Uh, so I mean this is more what they've written here in terms of like active forks or who are watching and
Hmm.
activity. I think those are more metrics.
Yep.
But in terms of I think a successful workspace uh, from a public network standpoint, the goal is to improve the discoverability and the time to first call for your APIs. So
Hmm.
it's not just people, it's primarily people who may have never used your APIs, who may have never heard of your APIs, could just like get to learn about them,
Yeah.
get to make their first API calls without having to jump through too many hoops.
Right.
Because once you start to kind of feel comfortable with a set of APIs, developers can do a lot. Once they kind of get it, what the functionality is, what the offering is, they are going to build a solution on top of it using these APIs. So I think it's not really about hand holding them
Hmm.
into building a solution, but really being able to get them started. So
Yeah.
it's very early discovery, evaluation, and development phase for for the customer of your APIs, enabling that journey, which is it should be clear what the use case is. Even the sequencing of the endpoints in your collection is something we put a lot of thought into, in terms
Totally.
of like what should be first, what should be later. This is something that people use as the first starting point. This is something people use later as their use cases get more complex and things like that. So from the producer side, the goal is to first enable the customer.
Yeah.
And then the way we can measure it is, in terms of some of these aspects, is being able to monitor how many people are actively forking our collection, how many watchers do we have, because people who are actively watching our collection are probably actively developing with it and maybe looking for changes.
Mm-hmm.
I think workplace activity is something that's more useful to the consumer. In something I mentioned earlier, is in terms of like, is this being actively worked upon? Is this collection live or dormant?
Right.
I think that becomes very important, because if you think from a user standpoint, a user of Postman, the thing is, I can search for PayPal and I
Mm-hmm.
can get uh, hundreds of results that not necessarily all of them are officially PayPal,
Yeah.
and there's other developers who could be publishing it. So it's kind of very important for me to find a workspace that is being
Yeah.
actively worked on.
Right.
And as a producer too, I want to make sure that my collection is actively updated and it doesn't get outdated.
Right.
Uh, it, it doesn't go out of sync with the actual functionality. So those are some very important things to think about. Is if you're putting a collection out there and you're not updating it for months, then customers are essentially having a bad experience potentially.
Definitely. Definitely. I love that you talked about that because I think activity really kind of shows, like, as a developer, I'm going to want to look at something that's highly active. I think that is also like a source of truth sort of aspect for me. And
I
so
think I generally go even further.
for,
Like when I'm
yeah,
evaluating APIs, I look at active workspaces.
yeah,
Are people publishing collections on
yeah,
Postman? But also beyond Postman,
yeah,
I would look at things like, are there questions on Stack Overflow? Are they
yeah,
being answered?
yeah,
Are there YouTube videos being published by the community rather than just the company? Because these are things that I think about in terms of like using
yeah,
an API to make sure that I'm using an active product, and
right,
that the community uh, it is using. Because if I have if I run into an issue building with an API and I were to post a question somewhere, then it's not always just the company that produces them, but also if there is an active developer community around those APIs,
yeah,
then they are likely to help me out. Uh, I think that community aspect is also something that really is important.
yeah,
And in Postman specific case, it's like if there are collections other developers have produced, that means they have tried these
yeah,
APIs and they have worked. So
yeah.
it really drives trust.
Yeah, totally. Let's do this example where I think you and I played around with this. Let's Google an API, like let's Google like email APIs and then let's try to find a corresponding workspace and like let's evaluate it from that point of view. As let's play like we're developers looking up APIs. So I think,
Yeah,
I'm not gonna
let's do it.
let's pretend that like, my first point of action might not be Postman. I think most developers Google things right away. So like if I were to just Google like email APIs. Um so I feel like there's this blog, maybe I'm
If
gonna
you can
trust.
go back, just let's look at the results though,
Yeah,
right?
okay, let's look at the
I
results.
think the results themselves are very interesting to me,
Yeah.
because there is, of course, like the ads that are paid.
Yeah.
So depending on who has like SEO optimized their site,
Right.
and uh, those can end up at the top. And then there is a mix of, like, if you scroll down right after the ads,
The first hit.
then you have blogs, or you have all these other APIs. Now, in this case, because I know I know that SendGrid's like one of the most popular email APIs. But if you think about it, like it's just showing up like so much further down the list. Like if I didn't know anything, then I would have to now like read through a few different things to like
Blogs.
make
Yeah.
decisions, a few different blogs, like 8 managed reliable email APIs.
Yeah, Gmail.
There's a lot of information to sort through.
Totally, yeah. And I feel like, maybe like just because I'm getting this as my first hit, like 10 best email APIs. All right, so let me take a look at that blog specifically and like take a look, okay, like some of the best email APIs they've sent here. So like just looking at like SendGrid's APIs since it's like one of the first ones. Let's see what that points me to. So maybe that points me to their documentation page, and all right, like I have to go ahead and create an account, all of that. But let me see, like this is like, okay, like Googling, coming upon the API, creating an account, eventually looking at their documentation. Let's just to look at, okay, if I just want to get a sense of their APIs just in general, if I were to search them just on Postman itself. So like if I were to just explore and just search, I guess, SendGrid, right?
Yeah. Or you could just search for email.
Yeah, or just search for email. Okay, let's search for email. Let's
I'd be
kind of
curious
do,
to see what
let's see
comes up.
yeah, we have lots of different email collections that are created by people. Some of them are APIs, some of them are Workspaces itself.
You can filter those on the left.
So if I filter them by like collection, these are all the various collections. I think these are all people naming their public collections, emails.
You could also filter by like public API network. So
Yep.
scope to public. And
Yep.
then I would generally go to teams at the bottom, filter by teams.
So it looks like, people have created specific teams and things like that. And I think when we look at something like this team right here, this is a team that maybe hasn't created like their, set up their workspace so much. So we'll go into a little bit of best practices of what that looks like what's the best practices to do that.
Let's search for SendGrid now. What happens when we search for email, you get this like across Postman, all workspaces and everything. But when you search for SendGrid, it's a little bit more specific.
Yeah.
So I wanted to see when you just search for SendGrid, like what results come up.
So I'm seeing like all of these specific results of like public collections.
Click on see all results.
Yeah. So yep.
So we can show people like what it looks like. And now we can filter by public API network.
Public API network, and then we can look at teams as well, or collections.
Let's just do collections.
Yeah.
So something I want to highlight here for people is you can see the stats of like how many watchers and forks and views each of them have, because that really helps you kind of understand what people are following.
Yeah.
So in this case, the top ones, one is by binary beast. I think the interesting thing is there's none of them that is by official Twilio.
Right.
So that's something I noticed right off the bat. The other thing is the top 2 seem to have significantly more forks and watchers than the others. Of course, the API evangelist, which is Kin Lane's workspace. Kin Lane from Postman, he publishes API Evangelist, and he has created a SendGrid workspace and collection, which seems to have 100 plus forks. Now, something we touched upon earlier is like when you create a collection and you see that last updated 2 years ago.
Yeah.
That's in this case, it's like we don't see one published by SendGrid, and the collections we see are that are most forked and watched are actually 2 years old.
Yeah.
So that's where, as a consumer, you're like, okay, there is this information. It could potentially be outdated.
Right.
Potentially. So that's one of the things that Postman kind of helps you filter through by
Yeah,
giving you this information right up front, which I think you actually cannot get that at on Google, right?
totally.
On
Yeah.
Google, you don't know when you get in that when you search for APIs, you kind of just go to the company site and you have to like read the API references and everything. You don't get this sense of like what the community is doing
It's doing,
with
yep.
these APIs.
Yeah, and in this case, like I'm seeing like, this particular person that might have created this fork, and then also this one that has like over 100 plus forks and like 10,000 plus views. So part of me makes me feel like, all right, let me take a look at this API. But like SendGrid, if you're listening, maybe you could create a public workspace as well. So that way there's some more documentation out there. But here, similarly, we have someone. So the API evangelist, great person, Kin Lane. He's created a lot of public API documentation within the Postman ecosystem, and I think his documentation of the SendGrid API is pretty good in terms of how to get started, at least at a initial level, rather than working and reading through the docs right away. I think that's the key aspect of having it here, right?
Yeah, the interesting thing is like in this case, he is not representing SendGrid,
Yeah.
but he's still putting in the work to make the documentation easy and accessible so that
Hmm.
you can get started within Postman and not have to kind of jump through a lot of different web pages and read about them. So I think he's doing the legwork
Yeah.
for developers, and
Yeah.
this is really the beauty of the developer community is
Yeah.
like there are developers out there who
Yeah.
are essentially putting in the work to enable other developers.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, that's something I think, especially if you are developers that work with APIs, I think this is a really great ecosystem for you to contribute back to share this with other developers and make it easier for them to work with specific APIs in that sense. So, yeah, this was a really interesting like walkthrough. What do you think, Deepa? I think what I got out of this is that documentation is really key. And we have like a checklist, especially of like what makes good documentation, and how to set up your collection for, maximum success and visibility and things like that. And then one thing I also got out of this is also how to let's talk about increasing your engagement with your workspace, and some examples of what that looks like. I think these are two use cases that we have, like Salesforce and Microsoft. I think we showcase them quite often.
Yeah.
But
So I think in
yeah,
addition to like, of course, when we publish our public workspace,
yeah,
Postman was super helpful in like, the search in Postman allows people to find your workspace and find your collections, which is great. And of course, something one of the audience members pointed out is like you can search on Google and still find Postman collections. So it's all indexed by Google, which is great. So you're getting this SEO traffic, you're getting the 20 million developers on the Postman platform. But something we also did at PayPal is, in addition to that, we added the run in Postman buttons across our documentation so that if you are a developer within who doesn't know who didn't find us through Postman or Google directly, the collection, you can still, while looking at the documentation, it's like, hey, you want to try it out? Try running it in Postman like right away. So it's not necessarily that you send traffic from one to the other. You can allow people to kind of seamlessly transition, because the goal of your API references or your Postman collection is the same. It's to enable the customer. So allowing that exchange is very important.
Definitely.
And then in addition to that, we also publish blog posts on uh, various channels. I think we have one on the Postman blog
Yeah.
that walks people through the the PayPal collection. There are demo videos that are on YouTube. So complementing your collection with additional content to help customers get started is also super helpful. So this
Totally.
particular blog post actually walks through actually making a payment and
Yeah.
looking at it in your account. So not just kind of make your first API call, but actually make a transaction in the Sandbox account, look at that transaction, and in PayPal, you can essentially even walk through like uh, uh, cancel, sorry, refunding a transaction, for example. So those kind of use cases, so you can expand on your kind of get started guide in you can expand on it in your blogs or in your videos and walk your customers through the whole payment in this case. Or if you are using an email API, then you can have people
Hmm.
send emails, see what the stats look like in terms of send open click data if you want, get some analytics on there. So you can complement your documentation with some blogs. And the good thing about using Postman collections is the developer is able to just make those API calls in those sequences
Yeah.
rather than building a whole application. So they can go through the whole payment lifecycle essentially.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a really wonderful, like the way the PayPal team documented it. And I think this is a great like call to action for, people that might be joining the stream, whether that's producers of APIs, consumers of APIs, taking a look at like some of the best ways to set up your account, or set up your profile in a way. And I think, we have some great blogs. Like for example, I'm going to share this blog that we've been talking about, which is all about increasing your adoption with public workspaces. And you can take a look at like, for example, like Salesforce's public workspace. They've, set up a banner, which was really nice. They've set up, their links on their sides. They've also set up their members and specific collections, their level of like publics and things like that. So we have a checklist as well of like, how to get started with building out your collection for visibility. And I think one thing that we do specifically, especially when we get a workspace that is really well used, is like one thing we can do is we can also feature them. So like we've been able to feature some public workspaces, on our live streams, as well as on our public Postman API network, and share them in like the trending workspaces category. And I think this really makes sense when it comes to that discoverability, which is key. So any other thoughts, Deepa, on that? Like, do you feel like what do you think that is best practice for maybe a consumer or actually a producer to get started? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think from a consumer standpoint, it's really being able to evaluate many different APIs, and if you're trying to decide something, uh, let's say you're evaluating if you want to build with Stripe APIs or PayPal APIs, and you try them both and see
Mm-hmm.
which one serves your needs better.
Mm-hmm.
But for the producer side, I think there is a lot more thought that goes into producing a good public collection, where you're really thinking about, and especially in some of these workspaces cases, like you have a global audience. How do you make how do you use tools and language and documentation to make it as accessible as possible? You think about how do you get it in front of your customers? How do you make of course, the API design itself is key. It's like if your APIs are designed really intuitively, people can definitely get started with them really easily, which a lot of companies spend a lot of thought on anyway, which happens like in the background in the design of the APIs themselves. But in terms of publishing the collection, having that up to date, thoroughly documented, easy to use, well sequenced, well thought out flow really helps customers get started. And that's really the goal. And in terms of getting featured, I think uh, I think PayPal collection was featured for a while there. It was
Yeah.
only launched earlier this year, so it's I think it's great. Uh, but I think from a producer standpoint, it's not necessarily like a goal because you already have a lot of users who are looking for your APIs, and the goal is for them to be able to find it.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little bit of a vanity metric, if I may say so. It's like, if I were to publish a collection and it got featured, I'll be super happy. Uh, but
Yeah.
I think ultimately the goal is to enable customers, which you can do with or without being featured.
Totally. Yeah. So we have like about 10 minutes left, and I think we did a lot. We talked through a lot of different topics, and I think we explored a lot of different things. But, I think I think Deepa, if you had a call to action, what would it be?
Create your
For,
first
for,
public collection.
yeah, create your first public collection. And I think, there's of course a way to create your public collection, which is, build a public workspace. But I think my call to action would be to really focus on the documentation behind a public collection and setting it up in a way that it is like useful and discoverable. And I actually really loved the example with PayPal with how the tests were embedded within the collection, how how the variables were all embedded as well. And so I think it goes beyond setting it up, but it's really goes beyond creating it in a way that is useful and for other developers to
I think
consume.
my
So
my
yeah.
call to action is really like I I'm I think there's so much value that developer community can provide, and
Yeah.
a lot of times, like I would like to publish collections that are APIs that I have used for
Yeah.
different projects. And the thing is like, oh my God, I spent 3 days building this project and figuring out these
Mhm.
APIs, and I want to like create this collection so that other developers can get started quicker than I had to. So I think
Mhm.
a little bit like how Kin API Evangelist has
Mhm.
built collections is like things that he tried, and then he found a way to work through those APIs and he created a few collections. I think that's a great way for developers to demonstrate their
Yeah.
experience working with APIs and also contribute to the developer community as a whole. So
Yeah.
I look at public workspaces more from the developer standpoint of like how, not just as like, you know, a representative of a company trying to unlock business opportunity, but
Mhm.
also in terms of like, just as a developer, I'm I'm building something using the Google Sheets API right now, and uh, I've used them before, but over the years they have changed, and I forgot what I did the last time, and and I'm kind of relearning them. And as I'm doing that, I was just thinking like, hey, I maybe one of the outcomes of my project should be that I create a collection so that other people can use these APIs more easily. So I think the same way that we publish GitHub repos where we kind of showcase our projects and our work, uh, this is a great place to showcase our work that involves APIs.
Yeah. And one thing I noticed is like it kind of takes the same like path of action. A developer goes and Googles, an API, finds documentation, things like that. But developer can also similarly search here. And I like,
one thing that I really loved about our conversation today is how to filter and find like, something that would make sense to use. And I think we have some interesting metrics like the forks, the watches, the activity of that particular API as well. So
Yeah, it's very
yeah, I think
similar
that was.
to GitHub, I think, for sure. And I think it's very much by design, because
Mhm.
one of the thought processes from a product standpoint at Postman is to keep the learning easy.
Yeah,
Keeping these concepts from a developer standpoint as familiar as possible. So we don't want to like introduce too many concepts, but allow
mhm.
developers to use the knowledge they already have. People already use GitHub, and I think it's really interesting that we just enable them to use the same concepts and not have to relearn anything or learn anything new, and be able to transfer that knowledge to Postman. And then when you
Yeah,
think about it, it's like getting started with some APIs using Postman with concepts and interface that is easy and familiar. Then you are essentially creating this very easy entryway for your customers
right.
to start using your APIs as a whole. Because what happens is a lot of times companies would spend a lot of energy and time in building custom tooling, which is great. Some of it is, incredible. But the thing is, when you have all this custom tooling, you're essentially relying on a learning curve, uh,
Right.
and uh, you can really reduce that if you use tools that developers are already familiar with.
Totally. Yeah. Well, I think this was a great chat. I think we went through so many different things. I hope this live stream encourages our, watchers to like think about, okay, let me increase my adoption, or let me create a public workspace. Let me make that a little bit more discoverable, build some good docs around it, and kind of contribute back to the community in that way, in that sense as well. And also, increase that adoption for your own consumption. So yeah, I think any last words, Deepa, before we end?
I'm really excited to see what new public workspaces our developer community produces, and I really hope that this chat and this walkthrough of the public workspaces was helpful.
Yes, totally. All right. Well, I hope everyone has a great day, and be sure to check out the Explorer network to learn more about the public APIs that are on there, and then check out some V10 features. I think that's something that is really interesting and new, and a great place for devs to get started, as well as producers, consumers of APIs. So
Thanks
awesome.
everyone for
All right,
joining.
Deepa. Thank you. Have a good one. Bye bye.